Before we begin, there's a quick poll below. Please take it. I'd love to understand y'all's general knowledge base before these lectures. Again, take it before the lecture. Our two choices for January were Israel and West Asian conflicts. As an eternal optimist, I initially thought both topics were great, especially given how much I love foreign policy topics. However, the community at large thought Israel was too radioactive, I think, and it was voted down by 2/3 of the student voters. West Asia, which not incidentally includes Israel, should be less controversial to debate, but carries its own set of flaws. For Israel, questions about the Jewish people and the Israeli state are colored by the events of the 20th century. In fact, the Israeli state was founded in the 20th century. And by resurgent anti-Semitic attitudes and increased violent hate crimes that have ramped up in recent years. Reddit user Memory Eternal explained to me, quote, "Debating Israel will just lead to a referendum on its right to exist in debate form. And with the recent spike in anti-Semitic hate crimes, it feels really, really risky. Debate is supposed to be an activity that everyone can enjoy free of violence, and debating Israel just lets in unneeded violence to the debate sphere." End quote. And that makes sense. There's plenty of other crucially important policy issues like abortion and suicide prevention and child trafficking that, while extremely important, we should not force the nation's debaters to enter into a month-long meditation on. This goes doubly true in the digital age, when what's said in the debate round, where often we adopt stances on issues we don't actually believe in, could easily follow you for the rest of your life. West Asia may be interesting to debate, but sadly, the resolution is one of the worst I have ever encountered. IMHO. As I wrap up my days-long research sprint, I'm still not totally sure what we're supposed to be debating. For anyone not lucky enough to have a coach to lecture, or a video like this one, it will probably take several days before you can start research proper. Specific and discrete policies like Medicare for All, HSR investment, or the US Space Force tend to make for clearer topicality, deeper prep work, and better debates, especially with 1 or 2 month timeframes. Again, in my humble opinion. Now, I'm not affiliated with a school, and I therefore can't vote on topics, so I assume I'm not welcome on the wording committee, but if anyone on the committee is looking for a +1, please shoot me a DM. I wish you all a Merry Christmas, a Happy New Year, a reflective New Year, and a beautiful transition to 2023. Now, let's get to it. Hi. We'll start with a discussion of the resolution, background of specific countries, then talk about pro and con arguments. One note, the quotes I use in this lecture are all cut the same way as in debate rounds, so the way that they're published is not the same way that I'm reading them, if that makes sense. The full cards can all be found with my cutting at debatetrack.com. A $10 a month membership comes with Discord access. The people there are cool as heck. And your support also keeps these lectures free for the community. So to subscribers, thank you. Here is your resolution. The United States federal government should increase its diplomatic efforts to peacefully resolve internal armed conflicts in West Asia. Let's try to understand topicality just a little bit. Diplomatic efforts are efforts on the part of government representatives, mostly career diplomats, but also by politicians like the president, to bring about change through relationship building and agreements. These efforts often take place out of embassies or consulates, like the US embassies in Yemen and Syria, pictured here. Diplomatic efforts stand in contrast to other kinds of efforts the government can undertake, like economic, military, political, and/or social efforts, although these are all quite connected. So Catullus and Jewel 21 say that in order to work, diplomacy needs to make people's lives better. Here's a quote.
U.S. diplomacy will prove more effective when it links efforts to improve the economic, social, and political conditions of the people of the region to diplomatic progress. In other words, the people of the region need to feel the positive results of diplomacy in their everyday lives. End quote. Next, peacefully resolve. U.S. interventions in the Middle East, and especially in the last 30 years, have been notably non-peaceful, with wars being fought in Lebanon, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria, and with the tendrils of our military reaching into every country through arms sales, military bases, or military opposition. This resolution asks us, therefore, to instead consider a more peaceful approach. Internal armed conflicts, or non-international armed conflicts, are civil wars. They occur within the borders of a country. They're not international, and at least one party isn't the government. Here's a couple definitions from IP Leaders First. Non-international armed conflicts are non-international in nature. This means that at least one of the parties involved is not backed by the government. Now, conflicts don't usually handily confine themselves to a country's borders for our easy debating, and most conflicts that are within the borders of a country are influenced by outside countries and also influence outside countries. So finding examples that strictly adhere to this definition is difficult. And in most cases, drawing a link chain only within the borders of a country ends up lopping off important parts of the conflict. The best example of this may be the territory of the Kurdish people, which extends across 5 different countries. If we want to relegate ourselves to internal conflicts, we'd have to discuss Turkish Kurds, Syrian Kurds, and Iraqi Kurds all separately, even though this hard distinction is a little bit absurd. As you can see by the map here, the territory extends contiguously throughout these countries. So saying that the Syrian Kurds are a special issue really loses a lot of the picture. From the International Committee of the Red Cross, talking about how these conflicts also must reach a certain intensity of violence. So if it's just a dispute, there's a few deaths, some violence, it probably doesn't count. It really should be a war, and that includes, that means that it has to reach a minimum level of actual violence. Again, from the Red Cross, the level of intensity of the violence is determined in light of indicators such as the duration and gravity of the armed clashes, the type of government forces involved, the number of fighters and troops involved, the types of weapons used, the number of casualties, and the extent of the damage caused by the fighting. The motivation of an armed group is not considered a relevant factor. So it's not just the bad guys, it's like a war. The ICRC also defines internationalized internal armed conflict, which technically would cover all the countries we'll talk about today, all have international interests and aren't strictly confined to single states. So that may have been better for the topic, but okay, we are here with this topic. Next, West Asia. West Asia includes 18 countries. The ones that we'll talk about here today are Armenia, Azerbaijan, Cyprus, Iraq, Israel, Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, Turkey, and Yemen. The more common term for this region, West Asia, is the Middle East, although West Asia is more geographically correct, and the Middle East is more vague, often including North Africa. Together these are called MENA, or the Arab world, which overlaps with these terms. So these are all things you may see in evidence in doing your research. However, the wars in Libya and Ukraine will fall outside of our geographic bounds. Although, of course, everything links in. Okay, there's a little bit on definitions. Let's go to a background. So, this lecture will cover 3 main conflicts. These are not the only 3 countries that will appear in round, but I will touch on a total of 9 countries that may and probably will come up. I don't think I need to say it, but I'll say it anyway. These summaries are extremely cursory. I invite and encourage you to learn more about each conflict, especially as you build contentions around certain ones. While watching this background, you should also reference a map. I recommend the Global Conflict Tracker map, linked below in the description, to get a grasp on the countries we'll be discussing, but if you prefer Google Maps, it is, of course, wonderful. Okay, let us start with Yemen. The Yemeni civil war, which CFR 22 calls a site of grievous civilian suffering, has been happening for 8 years. Peace has been hard to come by. Again, CFR 22. The warring parties observed a months-long ceasefire in 2022, raising hopes for a political solution to the conflict, but that October they failed to extend the truce. End quote. The fight between Saudi-backed government and Iranian-backed separatists, called the Houthis, has placed 4 million people, or has displaced 4 million people, killed more than 400,000 from violence and attendant lack of food and medicine. 2022 saw great hopes of peace as the two sides signed a ceasefire agreement that lasted for 6 months. However, the deal has now expired, and fighting could again open up in the future. The Syrian civil war is just shockingly awful. I really do consider these all to be the worst places on earth to be. The Syrian civil war has been going on for 10 years. 500,000 people are dead. About half of Syria's population has been either internally displaced or fled the country. So both are refugees, just different types. The civil war pits the Syrian government against various anti-government rebel groups, including Kurdish rebels. Russia and Iran support the government, and the US and its allies support the rebels. But Iran also supports some other rebels, and some rebels are all on their own. This is complex. The Islamic State, ISIS, also controls part of this territory, and everyone, the Americans, the Kurds, the Turks, the Russians, the Iranians, everyone fights ISIS. That's the one thing we can all agree on. Diplomacy has so far not worked. According to CFR 22, efforts to reach a diplomatic resolution have been unsuccessful. Geneva peace talks on Syria, a UN-backed conference for facilitating a political resolution, have not been successful. That is Syria, next Iraq. Iraq has been at war for 28 of the last 40 years, having invaded 2 countries, Iran and Kuwait, threatened to invade 2 more, Turkey and Syria, and of course, having been invaded and occupied by the United States. More recently, they've been fighting ISIS for 5 years now, which has displaced about 4 million people in Iraq. The country has long had internal fighting after its borders were intentionally drawn by the British after World War I to make the country weak, with only a tiny coastline and many opposing factions sharing the borders. Just in August this year, clashes between supporters of an Iraqi politician and an Iraqi religious leader left dozens dead and hundreds wounded. The US has since beefed up its diplomatic efforts, although the future of violence in the country remains unclear. A final note on Iraq, it barely squeaked by into the top 3. You can be sure about the topicality of Yemen and Syria, but as a judge, I would certainly hear an argument that Iraq's level of violence, we talked about that in definitions, doesn't quite cut it for topicality. Although 4 million displaced in the last 5 years, that is wild. Note that for all of these 3, right? And the next ones we'll talk about, you can build a case around one or more of these countries. So just have like a Yemen case or like a Yemen-Syria case or whatever you want. But your case doesn't have to, or your case or contentions don't have to be grouped around one of these resolutions, right? So organizing arguments around diplomacy-specific advantages and diplomacy-specific disadvantages, or US advantages, disadvantages, etc., can work very well, but you'll want to pull examples from these countries to support your case. But they don't have to form the core of your case or the core of your arguments. Okay. There's 2 international conflicts I'd like to touch on. Israel-Palestine is definitely a gray area. Palestine isn't officially recognized by the US and some other countries, some other organizations, so you can say like, okay, it's internal because Palestine isn't a country. You can make that argument. And Armenia, Azerbaijan. To be clear, I do not think these are topical, but again, to be clear, you will hear these in debate rounds, and as a judge, I would listen to topicality arguments on either one, right? Or if topicality wasn't challenged on either one, I would probably roll with it, right? The Israel-Palestine conflict, let's start there. This is probably going to be the biggest, like, quote-unquote non-topical country. I won't focus too much on it in the lecture, but it'll be in debate rounds. It's been going on essentially since the creation of the Israeli state post-World War II. The Arabs who live there have been fighting against the influx of Jews to the region, a trend which began far before World War II. It's not just a World War II thing. It had been going on for a while. And the official state of Israel, which has been notoriously repressive. Note there are also Arab Jews, of course. I am making this far more simple than it is. Like so much else in the region, we might blame poor management of the conquered territories after World War I, fall of like the Ottoman Empire, and World War II by the Allied conquerors for modern-day strife. Current violence, as recently as this week, is largely between Hamas, the Palestinian political and military group, and the Israeli government and military. That is Israel-Palestine. We will not come back to it again in this lecture. The Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, and especially the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, I did practice my pronunciation, is an ethnic and territorial dispute between the two former Soviet countries that's been ongoing for decades, with both countries seeing the territory in question, Nagorno-Karabakh, as rightfully theirs. Russia has played a large part in both peacekeeping and negotiation efforts, although it has failed to bring a resolution to the fighting. War broke out yet again in 2020, and violence has continued into 2022. This one is more unambiguously international, but again, I'm sure it'll come up. Let's talk about some simmering tensions. So these conflicts are they all? I think they're all, internal. So let's say they reach topicality in terms of internal, but in terms of like armed conflict, civil war, the violence probably doesn't reach the level where I would consider them topical. Again, you're going to hear about them. So let's start with Turkey and Kurds. In Turkey's west, the Kurdish people form the majority ethnicity in many provinces. Turkish groups both within Turkey and in neighboring Syria have fought against what they believe is Ankara's illegitimate rule. The Turkish Kurdish rebels, called the PKK, have been designated a terrorist group by Turkey and the US, while the Syrian Kurds have helped the US in its fight against ISIS, so are, or at least should be, important US allies. There are ongoing terrorist attacks in Turkey from the PKK. They think, hey, this is our land, you can't be ruling us. So terrorist attacks is essentially their way to fight back against it. And ongoing Turkish strikes on Syrian Kurds, again, neighboring country, although there is currently no real fighting in Turkey itself, to my knowledge, although the government is slowly doing what it can to assimilate the Kurds by settling other ethnicities in their cities in large numbers, etc. To call this cultural genocide would not be overstepping the bounds of the definition of that phrase. Lebanon is currently going through a political and financial crisis. Their own civil war lasted from 1975 to 90, but the country has been relatively peaceful since then, after soaring inflation, high unemployment, and general economic disintegration has led to tensions and unrest. But this hasn't sparked widespread violence now. Cyprus. The island of Cyprus is split down the middle, with Turkish Cypriots roughly controlling the north and Greek Cypriots the south, with a UN-brokered buffer zone separating the two sides. This arrangement came out of a short war in 1974, although its roots stretch back to the 1800s and, unsurprisingly, the British. Although tensions remain, the island is currently at peace. Lastly, Iran. Iran's push to develop nuclear weapons has put them at odds with their neighbors, particularly with Saudi Arabia and Israel, as well as the US for some time. Much of the general violence in the region, including Syria and Yemen, can be viewed in terms of Saudi-Iranian proxy conflicts for control. More recently, widespread protests have erupted across Iran in response to brutality by the morality police. However, These protests have not developed into a civil war, and the Iranian government appears to be reacting positively towards the protests, making changes. We have had a defund the police movement in the US. In Iran, they seem to be actually doing it, except, I mean, with the police, that their main job is to tell women to cover their hair or they arrest them. Those police, not like, assume not the traffic cops. Okay, so again, a number of countries that are probably not topical, but you could draw examples from, and you're definitely going to hear about. But Yemen, Syria, and Iraq, those are the countries we're going to have proper arguments on for pro and con, just for reference where we're going here. All right, here's the State Department background. So U.S. diplomacy is done through the U.S. State Department. It's actually called the U.S. Department of State. It's equivalent to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in other countries and is headed by the Secretary of State. So you will have heard of the Secretary of State. The State Department operates in foreign countries through their embassies, usually located in the capital of the country, and consulates, which are other offices, usually in other cities. There are 13,000 Foreign Service employees globally, plus an additional 50,000 local employees. So that would be Chinese locals in Beijing, French locals in Paris, etc. The work of these employees generally falls into two categories. This is not coming from Diplomat, this is coming from me. I don't know if this is true. It seems like it's true. The two categories would be like diplomacy, including economic, political, education, cultural events, relationship building, going out for dinners with important business people, things like that, and clerical work, which are visas, passports, paperwork, immigration paperwork, things like that. This is one area I will not cover fully, but it would be worth checking out the State Department Wikipedia page for a decent breakdown of the different ways that diplomacy might manifest on the ground. So our whole topic is about diplomacy. You should know, like, what does diplomacy look like in action? And Wikipedia gives you some good start on that. Okay, last, I want to talk about why the topic matters so much. These are impacts. Parts of Yemen and Syria, again, are most certainly the worst places to be alive today. I don't think Ukraine is close in terms of pure human suffering, certainly throughout the last decade, right? If you wanted to say a place like North Korea's worse, I think that would be just a matter of perspective, Smith et al. Talks about civil wars in general. He says that civil war does indeed have deleterious effects on the achievement of most of the MDGs. Those are things like hunger, education, gender inequality, child health. Mueller and Tobias 16 say that civil war increases labor costs, hurts GDP, damages the health and education of children, causing their growth to stunt. My own side note, exposure to stress and famine stunt the growth in children, right? Body weight and height, but also like brain development, everything about your body. So that's not something you can recover from, right? If you have lived a childhood of famine like that, like IQ reduction is forever. And intentional famines are tools of war that are being used in both Yemen and Syria. When you talk about like blockades, that's medicine, fuel, food. On refugees, again, Mueller and Tobias cite 600,000 as an average number of refugees created by civil war. That's on average. All three of our conflicts are minimum 7 times that number. Millions. Okay, so I would like to leave this section with an explanation of Middle Eastern civil wars, the best one I found from the Center for New American Society. This is good. This is good. Listen up. Focus. The primary driver of these conflicts is the lack of political freedom and economic opportunity in this poorly governed region. These governance challenges have created wide dissatisfaction and led to protests, which have then evolved into low-level conflict. External actors intervene in these conflicts in an effort to advance their own interests vis-a-vis their regional competitors, which transforms small internal wars into major international proxy wars. This pattern has repeated itself in Yemen, Libya, Syria, and Iraq in recent years. These proxy wars exacerbate the threat of terrorism by creating new safe havens for extremist groups, but also further fuels state-on-state competitions, which also leads to a higher likelihood of regional actors pursuing nuclear weapons. End quote. As you may be able to tell by now, fully prepping on even just these three major conflicts, much less the minor ones, much less Libya, just outside of the Middle East, will take a lot of work. So I recommend teamwork. Okay, now pro. Pro. West Asia is crucial to U.S. interests, to energy, to security, and to its allies. Diplomacy works, as a long string of successes has shown. Yet, as we pull back from militarism, we need to significantly increase our diplomatic efforts. The first question, why is the Middle East so important to U.S. global interests? Now, if you want to be honest, this bubble can boil down to probably one word. But you know what the word is? Yeah, oil. But to be more debatey, to dance around a little bit more this topic, why is the Middle East so important? Why is West Asia so important? Here's Catulus and Jewell. They note three core interests of the U.S., quote, protecting America from terrorist threats originating in the Middle East should remain a focus of U.S. engagement in the region. Continued terrorist threats undermine regional security and global security, as do ongoing civil wars in Syria, Libya, and Yemen. Economics. The Middle East energy resources remain critical to the global economy, particularly for American allies in Asia, such as Japan and South Korea. Values. The Middle East remains on the front line of the worldwide struggle for human dignity and universal rights, values that the United States supports, including religious freedom, women's rights, and freedom of expression. So, how do these interests, security, values, and economics, tie into internal armed conflicts? This is an important link. First, protecting America and its allies. In Yemen, the civil war endangers Saudi Arabia, our main Arab ally. The war in Syria endangers Turkey, a NATO ally. And any civil war is likely to breed extremism and terrorism, which, given our atrocity-filled history with the region, might reasonably be levied at the U.S., right? People get angry, people, about the conflict, people have weapons, extremism boils up, people don't have any opportunities. And where do they direct that anger? Well, the West, the British, U.S. kind of makes sense, right? Okay, second, economics. Again, oil. About a quarter of global oil production comes from the Middle East. And while the U.S. has plenty of oil, it is the world's #1 oil producer, many of our allies, like Japan, do not, and therefore depend greatly on continuing the flow of oil from West Asia. Lastly, values. It's a pretty soft argument, but it's certainly true that countries on the literal opposite side of the whole world have different values than we do. Of course, the U.S. has interests in the Middle East, but so do other countries, including America's geopolitical enemies. China seems to be solidly besting the U.S. in Middle East diplomacy. Before we go on here, I'm not kidding, open up Instagram, look up Xinhua News, which is usually like nature and culture pictures, cities and stuff, and just look at the post from December 8th and 9th. That's like if you're watching this lecture like today, yesterday. And follow the account, they have great pictures. And follow Debate Track while it's open anyway. The Guardian 21 quotes a Middle Eastern journalist who, quote, contrasted Washington's demands with Beijing's no-strings diplomacy, saying, while American policy is beset by baffling contradictions, Chinese policy is simple and straightforward. Beijing is offering Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, a simple deal. Sell us your oil and choose whatever military equipment you want from our catalog. In return, help us to stabilize global energy markets, end quote. This kind of unconditional diplomacy goes out to any takers, allies of the US and China that China would like to woo away towards greener pastures like Saudi Arabia, and enemies of the US whose strained relationship China can easily capitalize on, like Iran. Diani 21 also notes vaccine diplomacy as an area where China has been particularly adept at using, well, vaccines to gain influence, and where the US has been particularly poor. Next, Iran. Of course, the other great competitor in the region, who is actually in the region, Iran. Although a poor relationship between Washington and Tehran is certainly not inevitable, and although it seems like it would be a good thing to be on good terms with Iran, much of US government and policy does in fact view Iran as an enemy. Gray Seafood 22 talks about the security threat from Iran. Quote, Iran's threat to US and US interests in the Middle East include direct missile attacks, cyber attacks, assassinations, and sponsorship of terrorist organizations and proxy forces, as well as the increased danger posed by Iran's nuclear enrichment program. And, end quote, and Iran has its hands in all three of the civil wars we're discussing here by supporting rebel groups or militias and thereby waging proxy wars against the government or other regional powers. So this is like why it really matters that the US stays engaged in the Middle East. Let's talk about particularly why diplomacy is the right tool, though. For Pro, of course, it is the right tool. We should justify it, though. The State Department boasts a long history of solving conflicts with diplomacy. And you can trust them because this source is from the State Department, US Embassy in Georgia. Colombia, 2016. Sierra Leone, 2002. Northern Ireland, 1998. Bosnia and Herzegovina, 1995. Reykjavik Summit, 1986. And the list goes on. What are some of the benefits? The terrorist attack of 9/11 shook America. I'm actually always kind of shocked when I was a teacher. I'm not anymore, kind of a teacher. How many students haven't seen these videos? So, I mean, if you haven't seen these videos, it's, ooh, wow. I think that's how it is. That's how it seems to me. The terrorist attacks of 9/11 shook America. In the 20 years since then, America has not gotten more safe, nor have vectors to attack the homeland shrunk in number. I myself am rather shocked we haven't had another major attack since 9/11, and I wouldn't be surprised, although I'd be terrified, of course. I don't want it to happen, if there were another major attack on the US any day. US policy in the Middle East since 9/11 has largely emphasized the risk of reducing the risk of further attacks, or at least, that's what we say. There have been, ISIS really gained popularity by a long string of attacks on Europe. And so this is it's not like just, 20 years ago it happened, like it's been happening. So reducing these risks means reducing conflict, and the best way to do that is diplomacy. Here's some recommendations from Goldenberg et al. 21 from the Center for New American Security on the best ways to reduce the threat of terrorism and nuclear developments stemming from civil wars in the Middle East. Quote, pursue pragmatic diplomacy based on de-escalation instead of focusing on regime change and military solutions. Rethink U.S. security and economic assistance, focusing on investing in people rather than authoritarian governments. And reduce U.S. conventional military presence in the region. Cool. This has the added benefit of demilitarization, which is just like, as we increase diplomacy as a tool, we decrease militarization and wars as a tool, which the American public is very cool on using right now. And so that's a good thing. If you think that we should have less military in the Middle East, well, here's the solution: diplomacy. We've seen what's happening under Biden. The withdrawal from the Middle East, with the infamous withdrawal from Afghanistan, painful but necessary, and a less committal attitude towards Middle Eastern conflicts generally, as the shift moves to Asia and obviously distracted by Europe in terms of war. Truly, now is the time for diplomacy in West Asia. Other benefits, in reality, the professionals who work in our foreign service perform a huge range of duties and are crucial in a number of modern issues. Churel 21 et al., or Churel et al. 21, says that in addition to relationship building and spreading U.S. values and culture, quote, tools have been deployed against an additional range of complex threats to counter violent extremism in their communities, reduce greenhouse gas emissions in their businesses, and spread accurate public health information. They design programs to build resilience to disinformation and spread media literacy and intergroup tolerance, countering the hatred that can spread quickly on new digital platforms. End quote. So lots of things that they do, and many of these things will become more important over time, so more investment now is good. Okay. So that's all well and good, but in the status quo, is U.S. diplomacy to the Middle East sufficient? If so, we don't actually need to increase it. Churel et al. 21 again, on how U.S. diplomats are spread too thin, quote, there isn't enough time to do all as it should be done. Existing training and tools aren't adequate to balance these competing missions while meeting increasing standards of rigor and evidence-driven policy. Meanwhile, scarce staff time and resources in public diplomacy sections are often consumed by ancillary functions that support other diplomatic activities, end quote. Ancillary functions, again, like stamping passports. We also need a more professional State Department. Certainly, increasing diplomatic efforts might include training a more professional cohort of diplomats, which would require more funding, I presume. Here's Freeman 16, quote, "Despite mounting evidence to the contrary, we still seem convinced that diplomacy is an amateur sport. We show this in how we staff our country's statecraft and diplomacy. Our military and our spies are professionals, but for the most part, our foreign policy is crafted, led, and executed by ambitious amateurs." So dudes like me, like, hey, like, I like policy, that seems cool, let me go be a diplomat. But I'm not a diplomat, I don't know how to do that, but they might let me in. I make videos for YouTube. And look, the American public agrees with increasing State Department funding. Pollard and Rise 19 say that in a survey of 2,000 American adults, when given the context, support increasing the State Department's budget. And what is that context? The military receives 15 to 20% of the federal budget. The State Department, about 1.5% of the federal budget. So like at least 10 times less than the military. These are our two tools. Maybe we should be focusing more on the other one. Okay, that is why we need to increase diplomacy. It's good, it works, it's great. Let's talk about some examples from our three big countries. First, Yemen. U.S. diplomacy has already done wonders in Yemen. Stark 21 credits U.S. diplomacy for a ceasefire and assistance import deal, that's food and fuel, negotiations between Houthis and Saudis, and increased support for the UN process by other countries. And U.S. diplomacy has been essential, not incidental to these achievements. Pomper and Hanna 22, quote, "Washington helped open doors for the UN with the Saudis, the Emiratis, and even the Yemeni government. Ultimately, U.S. involvement proved crucial in making the April truce happen," end quote. Kurtzer and Boone 22 say that diplomacy is the way to go in Yemen, instead of continuing the fruitless and inhumane support of Saudi Arabia's attack on the Houthis. Quote, "The administration should intensify its already robust diplomacy by focusing on dual-track bilateral negotiations," the Houthis and Saudis. "Enhanced diplomacy could show both parties a way forward towards a reduction in violence and renewed efforts to resolve the underlying conflict," end quote. Okay, that is Yemen, one of the most horrible things in the whole world. Let's go to another of the most horrible things in the whole world. In the status quo, we don't have enough diplomacy in Syria. Lister 22, quote, "Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the resulting collapse in U.S. and European diplomatic relations with Moscow means Syria diplomacy is now all but dead," end quote. Yet the very credibility of our nation depends on our diplomacy in Syria. Our allies, the Syrian Kurds, have helped the U.S. in its fight against ISIS for years. The Kurds have been truly dependable allies. And now the U.S. is withdrawing from Syria, leaving them under the attack of Turkey, who again hates them. The U.S. is signaling, therefore, that being an ally of the U.S., that helping the U.S. is a bad move. We will abandon you, as we are doing in Syria with the Kurds, as we did in Afghanistan. Saleh 20 notes 2 diplomatic moves the U.S. should make for the Syrian Kurds. First, call a conference in Washington on protecting the Syrian Kurds. And second, opening a State Department office on Kurdish affairs. It's something. Also, that's from a couple of years ago. One or both of those may have happened, I do not know. Salul 21 recommends a plan for U.S. diplomacy in Syria. He says we should normalize relations with the Assad regime. As a realpolitik fan, it is a convincing argument. Quote, "Only those who are insulated from the costs of a maximalist policy can seriously assert otherwise. Many understandably find it difficult to accept that a regime that precipitated the largest humanitarian crisis since World War II can claim victory. But soon the threats that prompted the limited U.S. military, economic, and diplomatic interventions in Syria will no longer be salient," end quote. So yeah, Assad, torture, extrajudicial killings, child soldiers, horrible, horrible man with horrible, horrible consequences, but we've been fighting him for like a decade, and he is really the leader of Syria. Like, horrible guy, but that's kind of what people have to accept. And many of Syria's neighbors are accepting that. Many other countries are starting to normalize relationships with Damascus because they're like, okay, that's our neighbor. We got to get along with them. So maybe it's time for the U.S. to do the same. Okay, Iraq. Again, it's crucial to U.S. interests. Al-Qadiri in Torn 21. Iraq occupies a major strategic place in the region, straddling important fault lines, including the U.S.'s tense relationship with Iran, which will be a top priority for the Biden team, counterterrorism, and the stability of global energy markets. End quote. Indeed, Iraq has made a rather shocking rebound from the 2003 U.S. invasion that crippled the country. They're now poised to be a regional dealmaker and have already started to ease relations between Saudis and Iranians. The way to help Iraq is through diplomacy. They, again, continue, Al-Qadiri and Torn. If the Biden administration wants to re-engage the U.S. meaningfully in Iraq, it needs to establish much stronger local networks. It needs to adopt a coordinated policy that aims to establish the U.S. Relationship with Iraq from the ground up. End quote. So, those are the big three, but there are examples you can draw, of course, from many other places, historical examples or ongoing conflicts. Many, many examples you can bring to bear on your pro-arguments. Okay, con. The U.S. has been involved in West Asia for far too long. As the U.S. pulls back, the countries in the region are getting along fine with each other, including Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, the countries that aren't supposed to get along, the countries that are enemies. U.S. withdrawal seems to be really good. And even if the U.S. were needed in the region, which, oh God, it is not, the U.S. is so bad at diplomacy that it would likely only do harm. Okay, let's start with diplomacy being bad. Every aspect of U.S. diplomacy in West Asia is at best confused and pointless, and at worst, murderous. To start, the U.S. has no goals in the region. Here's a round panel discussion on the region, courtesy Alterman et al. 22. The U.S. has trouble deciding what objectives in the region even are. Sometimes we say we're for stability, sometimes we're for democracy, sometimes we're about nation building, sometimes we're trying to provide for the rights of women, so the objectives are all over the place. If we have no rudder to sail our ship, we should probably stop sailing the ship into countries with our missiles. Throwing our weight around halfway around the world with no clear goal has done immense harm to the region. So if nothing else, let's withdraw, let's stop the harm. Even if we did have real goals though, US diplomacy is abysmally bad. The US diplomatic machine is broken on the level of individual employees who have no real training or guidance, and systematically, as US bureaucracy fails to take diplomacy seriously. Dan Tsapogny, who served in government for over a decade as a U.S. Foreign Service officer, says, quote, "Today's diplomats are asked to rely on good judgment, but if good judgment is entirely subjective, expertise becomes arbitrary. I experienced this firsthand as a Foreign Service officer. I was not taught how to conduct a successful negotiation, to develop an effective strategy, to counter misinformation, to design a conflict prevention program, or any of 1,000 other tasks I was assigned." End quote. Again, this guy worked in the Foreign Service for 10 years, received training on none of this. If our diplomats receive no real training or doctrine, this may be only a byproduct or greater systematic failures. Freeman 16, we've cited him earlier actually as evidence that the U.S. needs to increase diplomacy by professionalizing its diplomacy. So pro-argument, it's bad, let's make it better. But the card also works for con as well. If we increase diplomatic efforts with our amateur State Department, we just spread this amateurish diplomacy all over the world, we're likely to spread chaos rather than peace, which we do now and which we've been doing. Here's another quote from Freeman 16 about our flaw of American exceptionalism and maximalism. We think we are the best. Our negotiations are, you agree with us or we will shoot you. That is how we do diplomacy. That is not diplomacy. Quote, "Come out with your hands up or we won't talk to you" is not a persuasive way to begin negotiations. Declaratory diplomacy and sanctions entrench confrontation. They neither mitigate it or address its causes. We are seeing that effect now with Russia in Ukraine, end quote. And this doesn't make our wayward efforts like confused or misguided, like oops. Actually, our hack job at diplomacy sows chaos and causes war, again, murderous, and makes America much less rather than any more secure. Rubin and Shanzer 21 say of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, quote, "The poorly executed exit, the rapid Taliban takeover, and Washington's abandonment of its longtime allies to the fate of jihadist death squads was like blood in the water for cynical autocrats, revisionist powers, and rogue regimes. Look no further than Ukraine. Vladimir Putin understood that American retrenchment amounted to lack of appetite for confrontation," end quote. We can see diplomacy versus pressure in action. In the different approaches of Trump, a volatile and harsh commander who made smart moves in West Asia, and Biden, whose diplomacy-first approach is sowing misery and chaos in its wake. He is spreading weakness, showing weakness of America. Look, I'm no fan of Trump, but respect where respect is due. Rubin and Shanzer 21 on Biden's handling of two countries. On Afghanistan, America's chaotic withdrawal certainly fulfilled a campaign promise, but it was foreign policy malpractice. And on Iran, the vast majority of Iran's nuclear advances came after Biden took office. Until then, the regime was remarkably careful not to provoke the unpredictable, even volatile commander-in-chief. All the more so after Trump removed Iran's most capable military commander, Qasem Soleimani, from the battlefield in January 2020. Trump's approach was, "We're going to take you down if you mess with us," and Iran complied. And there's more to it than that. Moreover, Trump's maximalist pressure sanctions campaign reduced Iran's hard currency reserves from more than $100 billion to roughly $12 billion, if not far lower. The regime was running on fumes when Biden took office. This constricted the regime's ability to fund terrorist proxies and caused Iran to think twice before engaging in other provocations, including on the nuclear front, end quote. Of course, Biden, with his diplomacy-only attitude, which includes reviving the nuclear deal, is looking to reverse this and again refill the coffers of the world's greatest sponsor of terrorism. Okay, that is why diplomacy is bad, especially from the US, or particularly from the US. Then disengagement. So if you believe America's military propaganda, you might be tempted to think that West Asia needs the US, that surely the region is better off with some US presence, right? But facts on the ground show quite the opposite. As the US is disengaging from West Asia, countries in the region are getting along better than ever. As US foreign policy concentrates on Asia, the US is disengaging from the Middle East and should lower its ambitions proportionally. Witch 21 writes, "While the U.S. retains interest in the Middle East, they are falling in priority within its global strategy, even as the region is destabilized from within, and U.S. partners there are less inclined to accede to America's interests or preferences. As a result, even a much higher level of American investment was unlikely to yield stability or even satisfactory outcomes. Instead, the U.S. should reduce its regional ambitions to match its core interests and the level at which it can comfortably maintain engagement," end quote. Yet, as the U.S. transitions its attention away from Asia, other countries are engaging in mending relations between themselves. A West Asia free of the U.S. is, unsurprisingly, a better West Asia. WAprez 21 makes a case for Middle Eastern diplomacy in the Middle East. Quote, "Something interesting is happening in the Middle East. For the first time in a long time, diplomacy is making some headway, and the U.S. is staying out of the way. While the U.S. is still the world's preeminent power, sometimes the U.S. is better off not tilting the scales in local and regional disputes," end quote. Lapson 21 adds that, without the global hegemon, the U.S. putting a finger on the scales, neighboring countries are indeed forced to get along better than if the force of the U.S. government was fighting for or fighting against their military. Quote, "For those who embrace the restraint school of international relations, positing that an end of U.S. hegemony in the Middle East is good for regional peace and security, these trends are very positive. and signal a maturing of the geopolitics of the region. If the US steps aside and is not setting the agenda, perhaps the parties will be more inclined to make compromises, end quote. Again, they all have to live with each other. Countries next to each other have to get along, right? Unless there's huge outside force coming in, take away the outside force, they'll get along. And the relations aren't mending just between US allies. Although the US often paints Iran as a perpetual enemy of peace and freedom, countries across the region are beginning to mend relations with Iran absent US focus. Hagarian 22 writes that, quote, prominent US foreign policy and Middle East affairs thinkers believe in a perpetual conflict between Iran and its Arab neighbors. The arguments presented by them are solely based on containing and countering Iran, with or without the revival of the Iran nuclear deal. There is virtually no mention of the ongoing bilateral talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia, Iran and the UAE. Hagarian goes on to note MBS, the leader of Saudi Arabia, who said, I hope we can reach a position that is good for both countries and a bright future for Saudi Arabia and Iran. Now, as with the last section, let's move on to our three major countries. A note about the following images, by the way. It is definitely something, it says something, that you can easily find pictures of people burning American flags from any country in the Middle East. Just Google a country and like US flag burning, and there's like a lot of pictures to choose from. All right, Yemen. Why should we not increase diplomacy to end the conflict in Yemen? The fact is, the US has been complicit in Yemen's civil war since day one, supplying Saudi aggressors with the arms they need to wage the war. Yemen truly needs less of America, not more. To end the war would mean working with truly unsavory characters, namely MBS in Saudi Arabia, who have flaunted human rights and even more flaunted their allegiance with America, even recently cooperating with Russia to increase global gas prices. Do we really want to be cooperating more with Saudi Arabia? In any case, the US has tried diplomacy in Yemen already, and already we've failed. Shalene and Rydell 21 talks about how ineffective diplomacy in Yemen has been and will continue to be. Quote, Biden's statement that we're stepping up our diplomacy to end the war in Yemen may have betrayed his naivete about the impact the US could realistically have. The war is likely to continue regardless of what Washington does. The lucrative war economy, inflows of resources from foreign sponsors, and the lack of incentives to negotiate spur the myriad combatants to keep fighting, regardless of civilian suffering. While Biden may not be able to end the war, he can end America's complicity in it. End quote. Here, by ending complicity, the authors just mean get out of Yemen. Don't get deeper into it. There were some hopes of peace this year, as UN brokered peace deal lasted for 6 months before it fell apart. That was Nagy 22. And the reason ultimately is that the Houthis are unwilling to stop their fighting. Fierstein 22 on the uselessness of Biden's diplomacy. Quote, Biden took 2 steps at the beginning of his term that he hoped would advance a diplomatic breakthrough in Yemen. He appointed a special envoy for the conflict and launched a process aimed at restoring the Iran nuclear deal, which he hoped would encourage the Iranians to play a constructive role in ending the Yemen conflict. Neither step has produced the desired result. End quote. He goes on to say that the Houthis just do not want to negotiate. They do not want to cooperate. They want to keep their land. It's where they live. Biden's efforts have not been harmless. In fact, they've been incredibly harmful. Zimmerman 21, the Biden administration has given the Iranian-backed Houthis the leverage they need to win the country's civil war. The reality is that the Houthis and their friends in Tehran have outmaneuvered Washington and watched, doubtless with amusement, as the U.S. has focused on Saudi Arabia's manifest disregard for human rights while swatting ineffectively at Iran's increasingly sophisticated military transfers to its proxies. End quote. As embarrassing, disappointing, and sad as it is, the only reasonable course of action for the U.S. to take is getting the hell out of Yemen. And unsurprisingly, the same goes for Syria. I do want to note here that I've said several things about Saudi Arabia, our relationship with Saudi Arabia. You know, they're bad allies, or they're our only allies, or they should be our allies, or we shouldn't negotiate with them. Make sure that in your debate, in your case, in your round, you're consistent in terms of your thinking about Saudi Arabia. There are different ways to view our relationship with that country, certainly. Syria. Instead of diplomacy, Lister 22 recommends a more practical humanitarian approach, which he calls freeze and build. Quote, with diplomatic efforts dead in the water and multinational institutions in a state of paralysis, the time has come to think outside the box when it comes to Syria policy. The international community must now pivot towards a more strategic approach to Syria, one focused on freezing existing lines of conflict and building zones of control and influence into self-sustaining regions of sustainability. And freezing conflict will require military support, not just more hot air from American politicians. Al-Misri and Salahi, 22. Should the U.S. maintain its lukewarm commitment in northeast Syria and limit its presence to narrow national security calculations rather than broader aims of stabilization and regional de-escalation, there's a risk that increased hostility would translate into possible U.S. withdrawal. The Biden administration acutely lacks the willingness to employ further military tools in Syria to achieve objectives, and as such has been amplifying its rhetoric on utilizing diplomacy. Lacking leverage capable of challenging hostile actors, the Assad regime will likely continue business as usual, aware that neither of its key allies, Russia and Iran, have any real challenger. This leads to a final point on Syria. Negotiations with Damascus mean acknowledging Assad as the country's ruler. Assad, a ruler who, again, employs torture, killings, child soldiers, kidnappings, who's used chemical weapons against his own people, who has caused mass civilian casualties, who's precipitated the greatest refugee crisis since World War II. That is the guy we need to sit down with and talk to engage in diplomacy. Do we really want to do that? As with Syria and Yemen, there's little the U.S. can do to change anything in Iraq. Although the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003, occupied the country until 2011, and has been involved there ever since, we still hold painfully little sway in the country, a clear sign that our actions do not produce results. Here's Slim 22 on renewed interest in Iraq by the U.S. How much this sudden surge of U.S. interest can influence the political trajectory on the ground in Iraq is uncertain. Events are primarily defined by local actors' cost-benefit calculi and are not easily influenced by outside intervention. Okay, y'all, we made it. Thank you for joining me. I don't really know how you sit through these whole things, but it seems like a bunch of you do. What's your secret? How do you focus? How do you do this? Leave any questions or thoughts you have in the comment. This has been U.S. diplomacy in West Asia to peacefully resolve conflicts, internal conflicts. I hope you enjoy it. The topic is a doozy, but I enjoyed making this lecture at least. I hope you enjoy debating. Peace and love to all of you. And I will see you next time for the February topic. Bye-bye.